Have you ever overheard something you weren't supposed to hear? And that single conversation changed your life forever. Ronan Blackwell, a powerful mafia boss in Chicago, never imagined that a few words from his housekeeper would turn his entire world upside down. He was used to the silence of his empty mansion, the echo of his own footsteps, his only companion. But that night, as he walked past the kitchen, he heard something that stopped him cold. Scarlett, his housekeeper, was on the phone, her voice cracked and trembling, completely unaware that someone was listening. "I need a boyfriend for tomorrow. Stay until the end to discover how one unexpected favor became the most beautiful love story they never knew they needed." If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in love. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that will make you believe in second chances. Ronan Blackwell moved through his mansion like a wandering ghost in a kingdom he'd built with his own hands. At 37, Ronan had raised an underground empire that made all of Chicago wary, a name that only had to be whispered to make even the toughest men feel a tremor in their bones. But tonight, inside towering walls and costly furniture, beneath art worth millions of dollars, he was only a lonely man. Everything around him seemed to mock the hollowness inside. He ate alone in a dining room that could seat 20 people. He worked alone in a sprawling study. He slept alone on a king-size bed where no one had ever lain beside him. Social engagements were nothing but obligations, places where he wore practiced smiles and took part in conversations he'd forgotten before his car ever reached home. No one truly knew Ronan Blackwell, and perhaps he no longer knew who he was either. 18 years earlier, when Ronan was 19, his father had been betrayed by the very people closest to him and murdered in this very study. Ronan still remembered the smell of blood, remembered the emptiness in his father's eyes when he burst in, remembered the sensation of the world collapsing beneath his feet. From an ordinary college student, Ronan had been forced to inherit an empire built in blood and tears. He learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Feeling was weakness. Loneliness was armor. And from that moment on, he built emotional walls so high no one could break through. For 18 years he lived like a machine, cold, precise, never allowing anyone close enough to hurt him. On that Tuesday night, Ronan was coming down the stairs to get a glass of water when a choked voice from the kitchen stopped him. Scarlett Hayes, the housekeeper who'd worked for him for 3 years, was on the phone. She was usually as quiet as a shadow, so efficient he almost forgot she existed. But tonight her voice was different, drenched in pain and desperation. Ronan stood in the hallway's darkness, with no intention of eavesdropping, yet his feet felt nailed to the floor. She was speaking to someone named Bryn, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. Her younger sister, Hazel, was getting married tomorrow. It was a big occasion the whole family had been looking forward to for a long time. But the problem wasn't the wedding. Ronan heard Scarlett say their mother, Margaret, was in the final stage of cancer. The doctors didn't believe she had much time left. Hazel's wedding might be the last time the family could gather in full, and the only thing Margaret begged for before she went was to see Scarlett happy, to know someone would look after her. Scarlett's family was very traditional. A woman of 27 with no boyfriend meant pitying looks, whispers behind her back, cruel questions from relatives. Scarlett had tried. She told Bryn she'd asked 2 acquaintances, but both refused because it felt too strange, too complicated, and now she had no other choice. Ronan stood there, listening to every word, and felt something unfamiliar stir inside his chest. A dull, aching sensation he couldn't name, a feeling he'd believed had died 18 years ago. For the first time in many years, he felt something other than emptiness. Scarlett ended the call, promising her friend she'd find a way, even though she sounded like someone making a promise she couldn't possibly keep. The sound of the phone being set down on the table rang out in the quiet night, followed by a muffled sob she tried to swallow back. Ronan remained in the shadows, staring toward the spill of light from the kitchen, where that woman was crying all alone. And in that moment, a decision took shape in his mind. A decision he didn't even understand himself. Not yet. Ronan stood paralyzed in the shadows, his mind a battlefield between the ruthless boss he was and the man who ached to comfort her. His reason was screaming at him to turn away, that this wasn't his problem, that this wasn't something Ronan Blackwell was supposed to do. He was a mafia boss, not the kind of man who fixed love troubles for his housekeeper. He should go back to his bedroom, pretend he hadn't heard a thing, and by morning everything would return to normal. That was the sensible choice. That was the safe choice. That was what he'd done for 18 years, building walls, keeping distance, never letting anyone touch him. But there was another part of him, a part he couldn't name, pulling him toward the kitchen. That part kept bringing back the sound of her muffled sob, the desperation in her voice, as she begged her friend for help, the image of a dying mother whose last wish was simply to see her daughter happy. That part wouldn't let him walk away. Ronan drew a deep breath, and before he could think himself out of it, he stepped into the kitchen. Scarlett startled and turned, her swollen red eyes going wide when she saw her employer standing there. She hurried to her feet, hands clumsy as she wiped tears from her cheeks, trying to pull on a professional mask even though her voice still trembled. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here. I'll go to my room right away. Ronan lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I heard." Those 3 words dropped like a hammer into the kitchen's silence. Scarlett went pale, shame and fear plain in her eyes. She was surely thinking she'd be fired for letting her private life show, for crying in her employer's home, for disturbing the quiet he paid to have. But Ronan wasn't thinking about that. For the first time in 3 years, he truly looked at her. Not the way you look at an employee, but the way you look at a human being. He saw eyes red from too much crying, the weary face of someone who'd carried too much for too long, the narrow shoulders that still forced themselves to stay straight, and he saw resilience, something he recognized immediately because he'd been carrying it himself for so many years. "I'll do it." Ronan heard his own voice say it before his mind had time to catch up with what was happening. Scarlett blinked, clearly not understanding what he meant. What did you say?" "I'll play your boyfriend. Tomorrow. Your sister's wedding." Scarlett's mouth fell open. She stared at him as if he'd suddenly grown a second head. What are you talking about? You can't." "I can." Ronan cut her off, his tone calmer than he actually felt inside. "You need someone. I'm free. It's that simple. But Scarlett stopped, unsure how to put it into words. "You're my employer. This is insane." Ronan knew it was insane. He didn't understand why he'd offered either. Maybe because loneliness had been chewing on him for too long. Maybe because he saw himself in her pain. Maybe because, for the first time in 18 years, he wanted to do something not for profit or power, but simply because it was right. Or maybe because there was something deeper he hadn't dared to admit. Scarlett studied him, her eyes searching for signs of deceit, for some hidden motive. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice still edged with suspicion. Ronan was quiet for a moment, asking himself the same question. Finally, he answered. "Maybe because sometimes people need help, and sometimes someone else needs to do something that matters." That answer caught Scarlett off guard. She looked at him a moment longer, and it seemed she found something in his eyes, a strange sincerity she wouldn't have expected from a man like him. She thought of her mother waiting, of her sister about to step into the most important day of her life, of the pitying looks from relatives she'd have to endure if she arrived alone. She had no other choice. "All right," Scarlett finally said, her voice trembling but determined. Thank you, sir." Ronan nodded, feeling a strange lightness at her reply. "Tomorrow, 10 in the morning, I'll drive." He said it, then turned and walked out before she could say anything more. As he moved down the hallway toward his room, Ronan realized his heart was beating faster than usual, and he didn't understand why. Half an hour later, they sat across from each other in the quiet kitchen, 2 cups of hot tea sending up soft threads of steam from the table. For the first time in the 3 years Scarlett had worked here, they were truly speaking to each other as 2 people, not as master and employee. The gentle yellow light spilled down, shaping a strangely warm pocket of space in the middle of the late night. "We need a story," Scarlett began, her voice steadier now, though her eyes were still a little swollen. "My family will ask a lot. How we met, how long we've been together, why we kept it secret." Ronan nodded, listening. "So what do you think?" Scarlett considered for a moment, then offered. "We met through work. That part isn't a lie. We've been dating for 6 months, but we kept it private because we wanted privacy, because we didn't want people prying. You do business, investments, so you don't want your personal life public." "Reasonable," Ronan agreed. "Anything else?" Scarlett started describing her family. "My mother, Margaret, is very strict, but she loves her children with everything in her. She'll ask a lot. She'll watch closely. Don't try to be too perfect. She'll suspect something. Be natural, but polite. And my younger sister, Hazel, is the complete opposite. She's lively, curious. She'll want to know everything. She'll ask very direct questions. Don't be surprised. Ronan listened with careful attention, storing every detail away. And the relatives? Scarlett let out a slow breath. They like to whisper and judge, especially my aunts. They'll look you over from head to toe, judging your clothes, your car, the way you speak. Don't pay them any mind. And one important thing, never mention money or any specific work. Just say you do business and investments. That's enough. Ronan nodded, the faintest smile passing over his mouth. You're worrying too much. I can handle it. Scarlett looked at him, doubt written plainly across her face. Can you play the part of a normal boyfriend? I mean, you're used to giving orders, controlling things. Not. Ronan cut her off, his voice even, but carrying something deeper underneath it. I've been playing a part my whole life, Miss Hayes. It's just that this time, the role is a little different. The words left Scarlett silent. She realized she'd never thought of her employer that way. A man with power like his still had to act, still had to wear a face. One more thing, Ronan went on. If we're a couple, you can't call me Mr. Blackwell. Scarlett blinked. Then what do I call you? Ronan, he said simply. And I'll call you Scarlett. No more Mr. Blackwell or Miss Hayes. At least not tomorrow. Scarlett nodded, then tested it. Ronan. The name felt strange on her tongue, and yet there was something about it that felt right, as if it should have been spoken a long time ago. Ronan heard his name in her voice, and he realized it was the first time in many years someone had called him. Only that. Not Mr. Blackwell, spoken with fear. Not boss, said with careful distance. Just Ronan. Scarlett, he answered, and her name was softer on his mouth than he'd expected. They kept talking a while longer, working through the small details, but when the clock struck past midnight, Ronan noticed Scarlett was exhausted. The shadows beneath her eyes looked darker in the lamplight, and her thin shoulders seemed to be carrying the weight of the world. He wondered how long it had been since she'd slept properly, how long she'd been holding everything alone. You should get some rest, Ronan said, his voice gentler than usual. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Scarlett looked up at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was only a simple sentence, but she couldn't remember the last time anyone had cared whether she was tired. She was used to taking care of herself, used to nobody asking, used to hiding her weariness behind a professional smile. She nodded, and for the first time that night, a real smile lifted her mouth. Thank you, Ronan. He heard his name again, and something in his chest gave a small, quiet tremor. They parted at the stairs, each returning to separate rooms. Scarlett lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow, about the strange man who'd offered to help her, about the way he'd looked at her as if he were seeing her existence for the first time. A few rooms away, Ronan lay staring at his own ceiling too, wondering why he'd done this, why his heart beat faster when he heard her say his name. They both lay awake in the dark, each with their own thoughts, yet sharing one thing neither dared to admit. Their hearts were beating one beat faster, and neither of them could explain why. The next morning, at exactly 10 o'clock as they'd agreed, Ronan's luxury car rolled away from the mansion and headed toward the farm outside Chicago, where Hazel's wedding would take place. Scarlett sat in the passenger seat, her hands woven together on her lap, trying to contain the anxiety rising and folding in on itself inside her. The air in the car was tight with tension, yet strangely, there was a warmth they both could feel, and neither of them named. Ronan glanced at her from the corner of his eye, and realized it was the first time he'd ever seen Scarlett wearing anything other than the simple work uniform. A pale blue dress skimmed her figure, bringing out the softness of her fair skin and the brown hair spilling loose over her shoulders. She's beautiful, he thought, and then he found himself wondering why he hadn't noticed it in the past 3 years. You look different when you're not in a black suit, Scarlett said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ronan looked down at what he was wearing, a plain white shirt and gray slacks, a world away from the powerful black suits he usually wrapped himself in. You do too, when you're not holding a broom, he replied, and immediately felt the joke might have landed wrong. But Scarlett laughed, a light sound he realized he'd never heard from her before. He laughed too, and it was the first time in a long while Ronan Blackwell had truly laughed. Not the cold social smile he wore at meetings or parties, but something real. Then Scarlett's smile faded, replaced by unease. What if they figure it out? She asked, her voice smaller. They won't, Ronan said with certainty. I'm very good at making people believe what I want them to believe. Scarlett turned to him, her eyes reading him like a page. That's not something to be proud of. Ronan went quiet for a beat, then smiled. a smile with something secret in it. Today it is. The car stopped in front of a wide farm dressed up in white flowers and ribbons. Scarlett took a deep breath, looking through the window at the cluster of relatives gathered outside, laughing and talking over one another. "This is it," she whispered. When they stepped out, Scarlett instinctively reached for Ronan's hand. They both startled slightly at the sensation. How natural it felt, as if their hands had always belonged together. But neither of them let go. "Scarlett," a clear young voice rang out, and a young woman with gleaming blonde hair ran toward them. Hazel threw her arms around her sister, eyes shining with happiness in her pure white wedding dress. Then she turned to Ronan, curiosity written openly on her face. "And this is the mysterious boyfriend you've been hiding all this time?" Ronan smiled, the charming smile he'd practiced 1,000 times in negotiations. "Ronan, it's a pleasure to meet you. Congratulations on your big day." Hazel grinned, clearly impressed by his looks and the ease of his manner. But before she could ask more, a wheelchair was pushed forward. Margaret sat in it, far frailer than Ronan had imagined, but her eyes were still sharp as a razor. She looked him over from head to toe, measuring every detail, from the polished leather shoes to the watch on his wrist, from the way he stood to the way he held her daughter's hand. Ronan bowed politely, then lowered himself to one knee so he was level with her gaze. He took her thin hand gently, as if it were something fragile. "Ma'am, I'm Ronan. It's an honor to meet you. Scarlett has told me so much about you." Margaret didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained on him, still dissecting him. "What do you do for a living?" "Business, ma'am," Ronan said without blinking. "Investments and management." It wasn't entirely a lie, he told himself. He did manage things. Only what he managed wasn't a normal company. Margaret nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but not objecting either. She turned her gaze to Scarlett, and in that moment her eyes softened. Her daughter was smiling, something Margaret hadn't seen in a very long time. The relatives began to crowd in, each one with a question. "How long have you been together? How did you meet? Why keep it so secret?" Ronan handled everything perfectly, calm and charming, giving answers with just enough detail to satisfy them but nothing too specific to pin down. He played the perfect boyfriend as if he'd been doing it his whole life. When they finally had a moment alone, Scarlett tugged him toward a corner and whispered, "You're doing too well. I almost believe it myself." Ronan looked at her, and the reply slipped from his mouth before he could stop it. "Maybe because it's not entirely an act." Scarlett blinked, not understanding what he meant. And truthfully, Ronan didn't understand what he meant either. He only knew his hand was still holding hers, and he didn't want to let go. Music rose from the direction of the stage, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. The real performance started here. The ceremony unfolded beneath the gentle midday sun, white petals drifting and tumbling through the breeze. Hazel and Connor stood at the altar and spoke vows that trembled with feeling. The bride glowed in her pure white gown, and the groom looked at the woman he was about to marry with a tenderness that needed no words. Scarlett stood beside Ronan, tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened to her sister promise love and devotion for a lifetime. Without realizing it, she held Ronan's hand tighter, as if searching for something steady in the middle of a sudden wave of emotion. Ronan watched her cry, and something inside him softened. He wasn't used to seeing other people cry, and he was even less used to the strange pull to reach out and wipe those tears away. But today, watching Scarlett cry for her sister's happiness, he felt an unfamiliar stirring deep in his chest. From a little distance away, Margaret observed the two of them, and the faintest smile passed over her dry, worn lips. When the ceremony ended, everyone moved to the outdoor reception. The host, a cheerful middle-aged man, began calling out games to lift the mood. "All right, now we've got a game for the couples," he announced into the microphone. "It's called How Well Do You Know Each Other? I'll ask questions about your partner, and we'll see which couple knows each other best." Scarlett went pale and leaned toward Ronan to whisper, "We've only known each other for one night. How are we supposed to—" "Trust me," Ronan answered, his voice calm in a way that made no sense. They were pulled into the circle with 3 other couples, including Hazel and Connor. Scarlett felt her heart stumble and race, certain they'd be exposed immediately. The host started with the first question. "Gentlemen, what's your girlfriend's favorite food?" Connor answered first, then the other 2 men. When it was Ronan's turn, Scarlett held her breath, bracing herself for disaster. But Ronan replied without a second of hesitation. "Pasta with fresh tomato sauce and a little basil. She always makes it on Sundays." Scarlett snapped her head toward him, eyes wide with shock. It was exactly what she loved, and yes, she often cooked it on Sundays. But how did he know? She'd never told him, had never once imagined he noticed what she ate. The host nodded with satisfaction and moved on. Second question. What's your girlfriend's morning habit? This time Scarlett felt even more anxious. She didn't think she had any particular habit in the mornings. Yet Ronan answered again, smooth and certain. She drinks black coffee, no sugar, and she always stands by the window for 5 minutes before she starts working, like she's thinking about something far away. Scarlett's mouth fell open. She hadn't known she did that. It was something she did without thinking every morning, staring out the window and thinking about life, about her mother, about a future she couldn't see clearly. But she'd never believed anyone noticed, and she certainly hadn't believed anyone cared. The host pressed on to the final question, and this one was the hardest of all. What's the thing your girlfriend is most afraid of? Ronan paused for the first time. He turned to look at Scarlett, and their eyes met. In that instant, she saw something deep in his gaze, something she couldn't name. Then he faced forward again, his voice gentle but sure. She's afraid of being alone, not the physical kind of loneliness, but the fear that no one truly sees her. The fear that even in a crowd, she's still invisible. Scarlett stopped breathing. Her heart seemed to freeze in her chest. She had never said that out loud to anyone. She'd kept it buried in the deepest part of herself. The fear of being forgotten. The fear that no one would ever truly see who she was behind the smile and the steady hard work. How did he know? How could a man she'd believed didn't care whether she existed understand her like this? And in that moment, Ronan recognized a truth that hit him like a shock. For 3 years, he'd been watching her more than he'd realized. Every morning she stood by the window, every Sunday when the scent of pasta filled the kitchen, every time she laughed softly into a phone call and then returned to that quiet sadness. He'd seen it all. While he thought she was invisible, she was the only person he'd truly seen inside that empty mansion. The host announced the results, and it wasn't a surprise when Ronan and Scarlett won. The relatives clapped and marveled. What a perfect couple. Look at how well they know each other. No wonder Scarlett kept him hidden. Turns out she's got a boyfriend like this. Scarlett pulled Ronan into a corner away from the crowd, her eyes still dazed. How did you know those things? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I never told you. Ronan was silent for a moment, trying to understand it himself. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I've been looking at you more than I thought. Their eyes met again, and in that moment something shifted between them. They were no longer just employer and housekeeper, no longer just two people putting on a performance. It was something more real, deeper, and more frightening. But before either of them could say anything else, the host's voice boomed again. And now, the next game, the kissing contest. Couples will kiss, and whichever couple kisses the longest wins. Scarlett went pale and turned to Ronan, and Ronan, for the first time all day, felt his heart pound so hard it almost hurt. The truly dangerous game was about to begin. Scarlett turned to Ronan, her eyes wide with alarm. We don't have to do this, right? She whispered, her voice shaking. It's just a fun game. We can refuse. But before Ronan could answer, the relatives were already cheering and nudging them into the circle with the other couples. Come on now. The couple who just won the How Well Do You Know Each Other game. Show everyone your love, an aunt shouted, clapping her hands in delight. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, smiling encouragement, her eyes bright as she looked at her daughter. This might have been the first time in a long while she'd seen Scarlett this happy, and it was more precious than any medicine. Hazel, still in her wedding dress, called out from beside her new husband. Scarlett, show them. I bet you and Ronan will win this too. Scarlett felt heat rush to her face. There was no escape. She looked at Ronan, searching for a solution, for some way out of this, but he only looked back at her, and in his eyes, she saw something that stole her breath. Ronan saw the fear in Scarlett's face, the way she bit her lip, the stiffness in her shoulders. He stepped closer and bent to whisper into her ear, low enough that only she could hear. It's just acting, like everything else today. She gave a small nod, trying to steady herself. Right, just acting, just a fake kiss. They'd been pretending all day. One more time wouldn't matter, and yet her heart was racing, and she couldn't tell whether it was nerves or something else. Ronan set his hand at her waist and drew her nearer. She felt the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her dress, caught the faint trace of his cologne, clean and masculine. The host began the countdown, and the couples braced themselves. 3, 2, 1. Go. The kiss started gently, politely, exactly as planned. Ronan touched his mouth to hers, just enough to look convincing. Not so much that it crossed into anything too intimate. Just a brush of lips, just enough to perform. Scarlett closed her eyes, forcing herself to think of it as nothing more than a scene in a play. But then something shifted. Ronan felt her breath warm against his mouth, felt the softness of her body in his arms, and suddenly he forgot there were people around them. He forgot it was her sister's wedding. He forgot they were acting. He forgot who he was and who she was. He kissed her deeper, not for the game, not to win, but because he wanted to, because some part of him had wanted this for a long time, a part he'd never dared to admit existed. Scarlett froze for a heartbeat when she felt the kiss change, when she felt him pull her closer, when she felt his mouth move over hers with a hunger she hadn't expected. And then, instead of pushing him away, she answered him, not for the performance, not because her family was watching, but because something inside her broke loose, an instinct she couldn't control, a buried longing, an emotion she was afraid to name. The world around them fell away completely. No music, no laughter, no wedding, no game. Only them, two people, and this kiss. Ronan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe not in his whole life. His heart was pounding, but not from danger the way it did in tense negotiations. Not from fear the way it did on nights he faced his enemies. This was something else. Something warm. Something he'd believed had died 18 years ago. Scarlett forgot who she was, forgot he was her employer, forgot where they were and why they were kissing. She only knew this kiss was unlike any she'd ever had. It was real, so real it terrified her. The kiss went on, as if neither of them wanted to stop. Neither of them wanted to return to the reality where they were only boss and housekeeper, where everything that had happened today was only a performance. Thunderous applause shattered the moment. They pulled apart, both of them breathing unevenly, their mouths flushed, and their eyes blurred with feeling, their gazes held, and in that silent instant they were both asking the same unspoken question. What was that? A long second stretched between them like a century, while around them the family cheered and clapped. The host shouted into the microphone, "We have a winner! Ronan and Scarlett!" The relatives applauded, whistled, teased, but Scarlett and Ronan didn't hear any of it. They only looked at each other, knowing something had changed forever between them. A boundary had been crossed. A wall had fallen. They'd won the game, but they both knew they'd lost something else. The line between acting and real had blurred completely, and neither of them knew how to draw it again. The dancing began right after the game ended, and before Scarlett could slip away somewhere to catch her breath and steady herself, Ronan took her hand and guided her onto the dance floor. He placed one hand at her waist, the other holding her smaller hand, and began to lead with a confidence she hadn't expected. His steps were smooth and measured, effortless, as if he'd done this 1,000 times. Scarlett looked up at him in surprise. "You're a better dancer than I thought." Ronan didn't answer right away. They turned in a slow circle among the other couples, the music drifting like warm air through the space. Then he spoke, his voice low and distant. "My mother taught me. Before she died." Scarlett lifted her gaze to his face, realizing it was the first time he'd ever mentioned his mother. In the 3 years she'd worked in that mansion, she'd never heard him speak of family, never seen a single photograph of loved ones in that vast house. "When did she pass?" Scarlett asked softly, unsure whether he wanted to answer. "When I was 17, Ronan said, his eyes fixed somewhere far away, as if he were staring into a past that had gone quiet long ago. 2 years before my father." He didn't finish the sentence, but Scarlett understood. 2 years before his father was killed, she'd heard the rumors. She knew he'd taken over the empire when he was very young, but she'd never truly considered what he had lost to become the man he was today. They kept dancing in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that belonged to two people sharing something private without needing to name it. Without thinking, Scarlett rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his shirt. Without thinking, Ronan held her a little tighter, as if he was afraid she might disappear the moment he let go. When the song ended, Ronan didn't lead her back to the reception tables. Instead, he guided her toward the back garden, away from the loud crowd. Night had fallen, the air cool, the sky scattered with stars. Music from inside carried faintly into the distance, turning into a gentle backdrop for the privacy of their moment. They stopped beside an old tree, the lights from the party reaching only far enough to soften the edges of each other's faces. Ronan looked up at the night sky, then spoke without warning. "I've never told anyone about my mother." His voice was low, as if he were wondering why he was opening that door at all. Scarlet looked at him, her eyes gentle. "Why tell me?" "I don't know." Ronan turned to her, and in the dark his eyes held a strange brightness. "Maybe because you're different." Silence held for a moment, and then Scarlet began to open up too. Maybe because she felt he deserved to know, after everything he'd done for her today. "My father died when I was 15, she began, her voice light as wind. "He left behind a mountain of gambling debt. My mother fell apart. My sister was still so little. I had to quit school to work, pay it off, keep the family fed." Ronan listened without interrupting, without pity in his face. He only listened, as if her story was the most important thing in the world right then. "I've never had time to live," Scarlet continued, a bitter edge slipping into her voice. "Only to exist. Work, pay the debt, take care of my mother, look after my sister, and then do it again. Day after day, year after year. I can't even remember the last time I did something for myself." "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known," Ronan said, his sincerity so plain it startled her. Scarlet gave a small, sad laugh and shook her head. "I'm not strong. I just didn't have a choice." "That's exactly what strength is," Ronan answered without hesitation. "Doing what has to be done when there is no choice, when there's no one standing beside you. That's real strength." Scarlet looked at him, and in that moment she saw a different Ronan, not the cold employer, not the frightening boss people whispered about, but a man who had lost too much, been alone too long, and was trying to hide his pain behind a hard mask. They stood closer now, with no one around to perform for, no reason at all to pretend. Ronan lifted his hand and touched her cheek lightly, his fingers warm against her cool skin in the night air. "Scarlet," he whispered, not even sure what he meant to say, only knowing he needed to speak her name. She looked up, her eyes bright under the starlight, her lips parted. They moved closer, closer still, their breaths mingling, their mouths almost touching. "Scarlet, where are you? Mom wants to meet Ronan." Hazel's voice called from somewhere nearby, shattering the moment. They startled apart, both breathing hard. Scarlet's cheeks flushed even in the darkness. They looked at each other, unsettled, and yet both of them knew something had changed. The line had been crossed a long time ago, and neither of them wanted to go back. "We should go in," Scarlet said, her voice still a little unsteady. Ronan nodded, but as they turned toward the lights, his hand was still wrapped tightly around hers, and she didn't let go. Nobody wanted to let go. When they came back inside, Margaret was already waiting in a quiet corner of the reception area, away from the noisy crowd. She lifted a hand and motioned them over, her sharp eyes tracking every movement the two of them made. Scarlet felt her heart pick up speed when she saw the seriousness on her mother's face. "Go help your sister," Margaret said to Scarlet, her voice gentle but leaving no room for argument. "Let me talk to him for a moment." Scarlet glanced at Ronan with anxious uncertainty, not knowing what her mother was about to ask. Ronan gave a small nod, steadying her with his eyes. She walked away reluctantly, still looking back at them more than once before she disappeared into the crowd. When it was only the two of them, Margaret studied Ronan in silence. Her eyes had clouded from illness, but they were still sharp as a razor. The eyes of someone who had lived through too many storms, who had seen too many truths other people tried to hide. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, and Ronan knew she was measuring him, looking straight through every mask he'd built so carefully. At last she spoke, her voice weak but clear. "Do you truly love my daughter?" It was blunt, without flourish, without softness. Ronan meant to lie. That was the plan. That was why he was here. All he had to do was say yes, smile, and keep playing the perfect boyfriend the way he had all day. But when he looked into Margaret's eyes, the eyes of a mother standing at the edge of leaving this world who only wanted to know her daughter would be loved, he couldn't do it. The lie caught in his throat, and all he could manage was silence. Margaret smiled, and that smile made Ronan flinch. "I knew the moment you walked in," she said, with no anger in her voice, no disappointment. Ronan felt his blood turn cold. "Knew what?" "I know this isn't real," Margaret answered, her gaze still gentle. "At least, not at the beginning. I've lived long enough to tell when people are acting, son." Ronan stayed silent, not knowing what to say. He waited for fury, for disappointment, for accusations. He had deceived a dying mother, turned her family's joy into a performance. He deserved whatever punishment came. But Margaret wasn't angry. She continued, her voice unexpectedly warm. But I see something else, too. My daughter doesn't look at anyone the way she looks at you. And you don't look at her the way a man looks at a stranger. That can't be faked. Ronan swallowed, unsure how to respond to the understanding in this woman's words. I don't have much time, Margaret went on, her voice thinning with fatigue, but each word still clear. The doctors say I'm very lucky to be here for the wedding today, and the only thing I want before I go is to know my daughter will be loved. Truly loved. Not pretend love, not someone staying out of duty or pity, but someone who looks at her the way you looked at her tonight. Ronan looked at her, and for the first time in a very long while he spoke from his own heart without calculation. I don't know what love is, ma'am, he admitted, his voice low and bitter with honesty. I've lived in the dark too long to know what it means to love. Margaret nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. She took his hand, thin and fragile, yet warm. But I know I want to protect her, Ronan said, his gaze drifting to where Scarlett stood, talking to Hazel in the distance. And I've never wanted to protect anyone. Not once. Margaret smiled, the smile of a mother finally finding peace. That's a good beginning, son. Love isn't something you do or don't know. It's something you choose. Every day, every moment. You choose to stand beside someone, choose to protect them, choose to place them above yourself. That is love. She squeezed his hand more tightly, her eyes bright with urgency. Promise me one thing. What is it, ma'am? No matter what happens, don't leave my daughter alone. Her voice trembled slightly. She's been alone too long. Since her father died, she's carried everything by herself, sacrificed everything for this family. She deserves someone beside her. She deserves to be loved. Ronan looked into the eyes of a woman standing on death's threshold, and he knew this was the most important promise he'd ever make. More important than any business contract, any quiet agreement in his dark world. I promise, he said, his voice firm. Margaret smiled and let go of his hand. Now go find her. And Ronan? He stopped and turned back. Thank you for letting me see my daughter smile today. That is the most precious gift you could give a mother who is about to leave. The wedding ended when the moon was high overhead. Scarlett and Ronan said goodbye to the family amid hugs and warm wishes. Margaret caught Ronan's hand and drew him closer, whispering so only he could hear, "Remember your promise." Ronan nodded, and in that instant he knew what he'd given her wasn't a careless string of words. Hazel wrapped Scarlett in a tight embrace, the bride's eyes still shining with happiness. I like him, she whispered into Scarlett's ear. Hold on to him, sis. Don't let him slip away. Scarlett only smiled, not knowing how to answer. How could she hold on to something that didn't belong to her? The car rolled away from the farm, and a heavy silence settled in the small space between them. The entire day had felt like a dream, beautiful and unreal. But now they were waking up and facing what came after. Scarlett stared out the window, watching streetlights slide past in the dark. Ronan kept his eyes on the road ahead, both hands tight around the steering wheel. They were both thinking about the kiss during the game, about the moment in the garden when they'd almost kissed again, about whispers beneath the stars, about the way their hands found each other as naturally as if they'd always belonged together. But neither of them dared to say it out loud, because saying it meant admitting it, and admitting it meant facing the question that waited behind everything. What now? The car stopped in front of the mansion. The engine went quiet, but neither of them reached for the door. The silence stretched, thick enough to choke on. Finally, Scarlett spoke, her voice small and trembling. Thank you for everything. You saved me today. Ronan turned to look at her, and in the darkness of the car his eyes caught a feeling she couldn't quite read. I didn't save you, he said, then stopped. He didn't finish. There was too much he wanted to say, and he didn't know where to begin. I just did what I wanted to do. I just couldn't stand watching you hurt. I just wanted to be near you. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he only gave a short nod. It's nothing. Scarlett watched him a moment longer, as if waiting for something, a word, a gesture, anything that would prove what happened today hadn't been only a performance. But Ronan stayed silent, and she didn't have the courage to ask. She opened the car door and stepped out. Before she closed it, she looked back at him once more, her lips parting as if she meant to say something. In the end, she only said, "Good night, Ronan. Good night, Scarlett." The door shut, and they went to their separate rooms, separated by only a few walls and yet as distant as two different worlds. Scarlett lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. Her hand rose without thought to touch her lips, where his mouth had been only hours ago. Was that kiss real or fake? She wondered. And if it was real, why didn't he say anything? Not far away, Ronan sat in his study with a glass of whiskey in his hand, but he didn't drink. He stared into the darkness, thinking about the promise he'd made to Margaret. Don't leave my daughter alone. But who was he? A mafia boss. A man who lived in shadows, in blood and violence. He'd done things she couldn't imagine, stained his hands with sins that could never be washed clean. She deserved better than that. She deserved an ordinary life. Someone who could bring her into the light instead of pulling her into the dark. She deserved more than him. They both lay awake all night, thinking of the other, but neither of them dared to cross the door that separated them. The next morning, they met in the hallway. Their eyes touched for the briefest instant, and in that short moment they both saw what they were trying to hide. Then they both turned away too quickly, Scarlett lowering her head as she hurried toward the kitchen, Ronan pivoting toward his study. The performance was over, but the feeling wasn't. 3 days had passed since the wedding, and the mansion had turned into a silent battlefield where two people kept trying not to collide. Scarlett worked as she always did, wiping surfaces, cooking meals, arranging everything into neat order, but the house no longer felt the way it used to. Every corner reminded her of that night in the kitchen, of the kiss, of the way his hand had closed around hers. Every time they happened to cross paths in the hallway, their eyes met for the briefest instant, and then they both looked away, as if holding the gaze any longer would force them to face what they were running from. Ronan tried to bury himself in work, but the numbers on his computer screen looked blurred and pointless. At night, he heard her soft footsteps in the kitchen and had to summon every ounce of willpower not to go down and find her. He told himself distance was best, that she deserved a better life, that he mustn't pull her into his dark world. But each sleepless night, he found himself asking whether he was doing the right thing. On the 4th night after the wedding, Scarlett was getting ready for bed when she heard noise from the east living room, the part of the house she'd been told she should never enter. For 3 years, she'd respected that boundary, never curious, never asking questions. But tonight something pushed her toward the sound, maybe because she wanted to understand him, wanted to know who he truly was beneath the mask he always wore. She moved quietly down the hallway, her heart beating faster with every step. The door to the east living room was slightly open, warm yellow light spilling through the crack. Scarlett stopped outside and looked in through the narrow gap, and what she saw made her blood turn cold. Ronan sat behind a large wooden table, his face carved from ice, his eyes sharp as a blade. This wasn't the Ronan she knew, not the man who'd danced with her under starlight, who'd whispered gentle words close to her ear. This was someone else entirely, someone terrifying. Declan, the man she'd occasionally seen coming and going from the mansion, stood beside Ronan with his arms folded, expressionless. And on the floor, 2 men were kneeling, their faces bruised, their eyes wide with fear. "You know the consequence of betraying me," Ronan said, his voice so cold Scarlett shivered. "No one betrays me and walks out of here whole." Scarlett felt as if someone had driven a fist into her chest. Every scattered piece suddenly slid into place. The enormous wealth with no clear source, the guards always hovering around the mansion, the mystery that wrapped around his life, the way he'd said he was very good at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. Ronan wasn't a businessman. He was something far darker. He was a mafia boss. She stepped back, and her foot caught on a flower vase in the hallway. The sound crashed through the quiet like thunder. Ronan turned, and his eyes met hers through the crack in the door. Time froze. In that instant, Scarlett saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear because she'd learned his secret, but fear of losing her because she had learned it. "Scarlett," he called, springing to his feet. But she was already running. She ran down the hallway, up the stairs, back to her room, and slammed the door shut. She pressed her back against it, shaking from head to toe, breath coming fast and ragged. Now everything made sense. Everything she'd questioned, everything she'd ignored, everything she'd tried not to think about, was clear as daylight. Who was she falling in love with? A mafia boss, a man who could order someone killed without blinking, a man who lived in a world of violence and blood. And then other images flooded in. The way he'd held her hand at the wedding, warm and protective. The way he'd danced with her, gentle and precise. The way he'd spoken of his mother, his voice filled with longing. The look in his eyes when he kissed her, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. There were 2 Ronans, the cold man in that room, and the man who had made her feel seen and loved for the first time in her life. Which one did she love? Or were they the same man, and she would have to accept both. Scarlett sat in the dark, hugging her knees, and realized a painful truth. She couldn't stay. Not because she didn't love him, but because she did. To love him inside his world would swallow her whole, and she wasn't strong enough to survive it. 2 days after that fateful night, Scarlett avoided Ronan completely. She calculated her work hours so she would never run into him, cleaned when he was out, disappeared into her room the moment she heard his car returning. The mansion, vast as it was, suddenly felt cramped when both of them were trying so hard not to exist in the same space. Ronan knew she was avoiding him, knew exactly why, but he didn't know what to do. He wanted to find her, wanted to explain. But explain what? That he wasn't a mafia boss? That what she'd seen wasn't real? He couldn't lie to her, not after everything that had happened between them. He was exactly what she thought, and that truth tasted more bitter than any lie. On Sunday morning, as Ronan sat in his study staring into nothing, a soft knock sounded at the door. His heart began to beat faster because he knew who it was. "Come in," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. The door opened, and Scarlett stepped inside. Her face was pale, the shadows beneath her eyes proof she hadn't been sleeping either. But there was a resolve in her gaze Ronan recognized at once. She'd made a decision, and he knew he wasn't going to like what she was about to say. "I want to resign." Those 5 words fell like a sledgehammer, shattering the fragile hope Ronan hadn't dared to admit he'd been carrying. Even though he'd known this could happen, even though he'd been bracing himself since the night she'd seen him in that room, hearing it still felt like a fist driven straight into his chest. "Because of what you saw that night?" he asked, his voice low and tired. Scarlett swallowed, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Partly. And the rest?" Ronan pressed, even though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Silence hung between them, heavy and painful. Then Scarlett lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes, and began to speak, her voice trembling but each word clear. "Because I can't keep working here. Not because of the job, but because after what happened, I can't look at you as my employer anymore." Ronan rose and took a step toward her. "Scarlett," but she lifted a hand, stopping him, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "And I have no right to look at you in any other way," she went on, her voice breaking. "Who are you? Who am I? We live in completely different worlds. You live in the dark, in blood and violence. And I'm just a housekeeper with debt and a sick mother. How could I ever belong in your world?" She wiped at her tears, but they kept coming. "I can't stay here. Every day seeing you, pretending that kiss meant nothing, pretending the night in the garden never happened, pretending I don't." She stopped, as if she couldn't make herself finish the sentence. "Don't what?" Ronan asked, his voice turning rough with the emotion he was trying to hold back. Scarlett looked at him, her eyes red and flooded, and said the thing she'd been fighting to keep hidden for so long, "Pretending I don't love you." Ronan went still. This was the first time in his life he'd heard those words said to him. Not for money, not for power, not out of fear, but real love, from an honest heart. And she was saying it as she said goodbye. The cruel irony of it made him want to laugh, but he couldn't, because the pain in his chest was too big. He wanted to say 1,000 things. He wanted to tell her he loved her too. He wanted to tell her she was the most beautiful thing that had ever entered his dark life. He wanted to say he would change, that he would leave it all behind for her, but his throat closed, and not a single word came out. Scarlett set her resignation letter on his desk, her hand shaking slightly. "I'll finish out 2 weeks," she said, and then she turned, walking toward the door. Ronan watched her, wanting to call her back, wanting to shout "Don't go," wanting to run to her and hold her and tell her he loved her too. But then he thought of his world, of enemies waiting in the shadows, of blood and violence he could never scrub from his hands. She was right. His world would swallow her whole. Letting her go was the only way to protect her. So he stayed silent, and he let her go. The door clicked shut behind Scarlett, a small sound, but to Ronan it landed like thunder. He sank back into his chair and stared at the resignation letter on his desk, her neat, handwritten lines blurring in front of his eyes. And for the first time in 18 years, since the day his father died, Ronan Blackwell's eyes filled with tears. 14 days. That was the time Ronan had before Scarlett walked out of his life for good. Each day that passed felt like a knife sliding deeper into his heart. He watched her work through the glass, watched her quietly pack her things little by little, as if she, too, were delaying, as if she didn't want to leave but had no other choice. They avoided each other. Yet strangely, the great mansion began to feel small, when both of them were trying so hard not to share the same space. He heard her footsteps in the kitchen in the morning, heard her humming softly when she thought no one was listening, heard even the sigh she let out whenever she passed his study door. At night, Ronan couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, imagining how empty this house would feel without the light sound of her steps, without the scent of coffee she made each morning, without the simple awareness that someone else was here with him. And he faced a painful truth he'd tried to deny for 3 years. She had become the reason he looked forward to coming home, without ever realizing it. Every day, no matter how brutal the work was, he still found himself hurrying back to the mansion, not because of the house, but because she was here. Declan, his right hand, noticed the change. "What's wrong with you?" Declan asked on the 7th day, after seeing Ronan sit in his study, staring into nothing for hours. "You look like you've lost your soul." Ronan didn't answer. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain that he was losing the woman he loved, the woman he'd never had the courage to name out loud. On the 10th day, Declan came into the study with a grim face. "Bad news, boss," he said, his voice low with worry. "Someone's targeting you. They're watching the people around you." Ronan looked up, his blood turning cold. "Who?" "Not sure yet," Declan shook his head. "But they know about your housekeeper. They know she matters to you." Ronan's heart seemed to stop. Scarlett. They knew about Scarlett. He'd always feared this, that his dark world would reach out and harm the people near him. And now that fear had become real, a cruel choice opened in front of him. If Scarlett stayed, she could be in danger. His enemies wouldn't hesitate to use her to threaten him. But if he let her go, she would be safe, and he would lose her forever. Did loving her mean letting her go to protect her? Or did loving her mean fighting to keep her close and shielding her at any cost? On the 13th night, the night before Scarlett was due to leave, Ronan sat alone in his study with darkness pressed in around him. On the desk in front of him lay her resignation letter, her neat handwriting seeming to mock him. He remembered his promise to Margaret, the promise he'd sworn he would keep. "Don't leave my daughter alone. She's been alone too long." He remembered the kiss at the wedding, the softness of Scarlett's mouth under his, the way she'd answered him as if she wanted it with her whole heart. He remembered the way she'd said the words, "I love you," as she was saying goodbye, tears in her eyes, and yet still looking straight at him. He thought about his life. 18 years lived in the dark, alone, safe, behind high walls and an army of guards. Safe, but slowly dying inside loneliness. Safe, but never truly living. And then, in the deepest quiet of the night, Ronan made his decision. He couldn't let her go without telling her the truth. He couldn't live an entire life with the regret that he'd watched the woman he loved walk out the door without ever knowing how he felt. If she still chose to leave after she knew, at least he wouldn't have to spend years wondering what would have happened if he'd spoken. And if she chose to stay, he would protect her at any cost. With his own life, if that was what it took. He picked up the phone and called Declan. "Increase security," he ordered, his voice hard and decisive in a way it hadn't been in 2 weeks. "Find who's watching, and prepare everything." "Everything for what?" Declan asked. "For the fact that I'm going to fight." The next morning, Ronan stood outside Scarlett's door, his heart hammering as if he were about to step into the most important battle of his life. He knocked, and when she opened it, her eyes widened with surprise at the sight of him. He spoke before she could react. "I need to talk to you. Not as employer and employee, as two people. Meet me at the coffee shop on Oak Street at 3 o'clock this afternoon." Then he turned away without waiting for her answer, because he knew if he looked into her eyes for even one more second, he wouldn't have the strength to wait until afternoon. The small coffee shop sat on the corner of Oak Street, a quiet place far from the mansion and the chaotic world Ronan had built. He arrived 30 minutes early, too anxious to stay home for even one more second. He chose a table in the corner, private enough that they could talk without being disturbed. He ordered a cup of coffee but didn't drink it, only sat there staring through the window, waiting. His hand trembled slightly when he lifted the cup and set it down again. Something that had never happened to him, not in the most dangerous negotiations, not when he faced the most vicious enemies. But this was different. This wasn't business, wasn't power, wasn't life or death in the literal sense. This mattered more than all of that put together. This was his heart, the thing he'd guarded for 18 years, now laid on the table, waiting for judgment. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the door opened, and Scarlett walked in. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose over her shoulders, her face bare of makeup, the shadows beneath her eyes showing she hadn't slept much either. Ronan's heart nearly leapt out of his chest at the sight of her. She was beautiful, so beautiful it hurt, and he wondered how he could have been blind for 3 years and not seen it. Scarlett looked around, spotted him in the corner, and walked over to sit across from him. She didn't speak. She only looked at him with eyes full of questions, her hands on the table, clenched tightly together. Ronan drew a deep breath, trying to find words for everything he wanted to say. Everything he'd been thinking for 14 days. "Scarlett," he began, his voice low and thick with feeling. "The day at your sister's wedding was the realest day of my life." She watched him, saying nothing, waiting. "For 37 years, I've lived to build an empire, to collect power, thinking it would fill the emptiness my father left behind when he was taken from me." He continued, his gaze locked on hers. But it didn't. It only made the emptiness bigger, deeper, more painful. He paused and swallowed. "I've done terrible things, Scarlett. You saw it. I am what you think I am. A mafia boss. A man who lives in the dark. A man with blood on his hands. I won't lie to you about that. I can't, and I don't want to." Scarlett swallowed, her eyes shining, but she stayed silent, listening. "But you also saw something else," Ronan went on, his voice softening. "The way I danced with you that night. The way I spoke about my mother. The way I held your hand like I didn't want to let go. That is also me. The part of me I thought died a long time ago. The day my mother passed. The day my father was killed. But it didn't die. It was only waiting for the right person to wake it up." He paused, searching her eyes. "That day, when I watched you take care of your mother, hold your sister, be light for everyone around you, I realized I've been living wrong my whole life. I built an empire and had no one to share it with. I had everything and yet nothing that truly mattered. And then you came along. You've been there for 3 years, right in front of me, and I was too blind to see you." Ronan took a deep breath and said the thing that mattered most. "I'm not asking you to come back to work. I never want you to be my employee again." Scarlett blinked, confusion plain on her face. "I'm asking you to give me a chance to love you for real," Ronan said, his voice shaking slightly. "Not for one borrowed day like the wedding, but for all the days ahead. All the days I have left. I know my world is dangerous. I know someone is coming for me, and that could put you in danger, but I swear I'll protect you at any cost. With my life, if that's what it takes. You are the only thing in my life worth anything, and I'm willing to fight the whole world to keep you safe." His voice shook more when he asked the final question. "Will you give me that chance?" Silence settled between them. Scarlett began to cry, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks and falling onto the wooden table. Ronan waited, his heart barely beating, waiting for the answer that could destroy him or save him. The moment stretched like an entire lifetime. Then Scarlett lifted her hand and touched his face, and only then did Ronan realize he was crying too. She gently wiped the tear on his cheek, a touch so tender it made him want to cry harder. "I need to tell you something too," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ronan held his breath, waiting. "I felt something that day too," Scarlett began, her voice trembling slightly but steady with honesty. "At first I thought it was only gratitude. Gratitude because you saved me from an impossible situation. Gratitude because you helped give my mother one happy day. Or maybe it was only a passing rush of emotion, a play turning real by accident, because we acted too well." She gave a small smile through her tears, a sad smile, and yet one filled with hope. "But these past days, while I've been packing to leave, I've realized something. Every time I put an item into my suitcase, I think of you. Every corner of that house I look at, I see a memory of you. I miss you. Not my employer, the person. I miss the way you smile when you like the food I cook. That rare smile I've only seen a handful of times in 3 years. I miss the way you work late because you care, how the light in your study is always the last one to go dark in that entire house. I miss the small moments of kindness you didn't have to offer, like the nights you left a cup of hot tea outside my door in the winter, saying nothing, just leaving it there and walking away." Scarlett stopped and drew a deep breath, as if she were bracing herself to say what mattered most. "I realized I started falling in love with you long before the wedding, maybe in my 2nd year working there. In the little moments I didn't even notice at the time. When I saw you standing alone by the window late at night. When I heard you on the phone with that tired voice. When I understood that the powerful man everyone fears is, in his own way, as lonely as I am." She looked into his eyes, her own bright even as tears still clung to her lashes. "And when you kissed me during the game, I knew it was too late to protect my heart. It had belonged to you for a long time. I just didn't have the courage to admit it. Scarlett took Ronan's hand and held it tight. I know who you are. I saw your darkness that night, saw the coldness, saw the ruthless world you live in. But I also saw the light in your eyes when you look at me, when you hold my hand, when you made that promise to my mother. That is you too, and I love both parts. She paused and met his gaze with a certainty she'd never had before. I don't need you to be perfect, Ronan. I just need you to be real. Ronan felt his heart crack open and mend at the same time. He stood, and to the surprise of everyone in the coffee shop, he dropped to one knee beside Scarlett. He didn't care about curious looks, didn't care about anything except the woman sitting in front of him. He took both her hands in his, feeling her warmth, the truth of this moment. I don't want to play a part anymore, Scarlett. I want the real thing. I want you, forever. Scarlett nodded through tears, and the brightest smile he'd ever seen bloomed on her mouth. Yes, I want to try with you. Ronan pulled her into his arms and kissed her right there in that small coffee shop. This time there was no audience waiting for a game to end, no family cheering, no performance to maintain, only two people who had been alone too long, two hearts that had been hurt too much, finally finding each other. When they parted, they both laughed through tears, tears of happiness for the first time in far too long. I'll protect you, Ronan said, his voice firm and full of promise. From everything, even from myself if I have to. Scarlett shook her head and lifted her hand to stroke his cheek. I don't need you to protect me from you. I need you beside me, always. I promise, he said, and for the first time in his life, Ronan knew it was a promise he would keep at any cost. They sat in the coffee shop until the sunset stained the sky red, talking about everything and nothing, laughing and crying, sharing dreams and fears. For the first time in their lives, neither of them was alone. Ronan took out his phone and called Declan. She's staying, he said, his eyes never leaving Scarlett. Double the security. Find the ones watching. No one touches her. Scarlett heard and smiled. Sounds dangerous. Ronan looked at her, his eyes full of love and determination. It is, but are you ready? Scarlett clasped his hand and squeezed. With you? Ready for anything? They left the coffee shop after dark, hand in hand, stepping into a future they couldn't see yet. There would be challenges ahead, enemies, shadows they would have to face, but they would face them together. 2 years later, at the same farm outside Chicago where everything had begun, an intimate wedding took place beneath the gentle light of an autumn sun. White chairs stood in neat rows on the green lawn. Fresh flowers were arranged everywhere, and soft music drifted through the warm air. Margaret sat in the very first row in her wheelchair, far thinner than she had been 2 years earlier. Yet her eyes still shone, and her radiant smile never faded. Doctors had said she wouldn't make it through the first year, but she had fought because she wanted to see this day, the day her daughter walked down the aisle toward the man Margaret knew would love her and protect her for the rest of her life. Hazel stood beside Scarlett as maid of honor, crying even more than the bride, constantly dabbing her eyes with a white lace handkerchief. Declan stood beside Ronan as best man, and for the first time in his life, someone saw the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, trembling as he waited for his bride. Then the music changed, and Scarlett appeared at the end of the aisle. She wore a pure white wedding dress, simple but elegant, her hands holding a small, lovely bouquet. She walked slowly, never taking her eyes off Ronan for even a second. Ronan looked at her, and in that moment every shadow in his life dissolved. All the years of loneliness, all the sleepless nights, all the walls he had built around his heart, none of it mattered anymore, because she was here, walking toward him, ready to spend her life beside him. She was his light. She always had been. When Scarlett reached him, Ronan took her hand and began his vows, his voice trembling with emotion. You saved me, Scarlett, not from enemies or danger, but from myself, from the loneliness I thought was armor, when it was really a prison that held me for so many years. You showed me that life isn't only surviving, it's loving and being loved, Scarlett cried. Yet she smiled, the most beautiful smile he had ever seen. And you showed me that I deserve to be loved, she answered, her voice breaking. That sacrificing for others doesn't mean I have to be alone, that I have a right to happiness too. Ronan slid the ring onto her finger, then said, I promise I'll stand beside you, every day, every moment, in the light and in the dark, until my heart stops beating. I promise too, Scarlett said, placing the ring on his hand. They kissed to the sound of applause and happy tears from their family. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her cheeks, whispering, "Thank God. Thank God you let me live long enough to see this day." That night, after the wedding celebration ended, Ronan and Scarlett stood in the back garden of the farm, the same place where they had almost kissed for the first time 2 years before. The moon was bright in the sky, and the music from the party still drifted faintly in the distance. "Did you ever think one overheard sentence could change an entire life?" Scarlett asked, resting her head against his chest. Ronan smiled and kissed her forehead. "No, but I do know this. Sometimes one unexpected day with the right person can become the beginning of a love that lasts a lifetime, because real love doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs two hearts willing to try together." And they tried, and they made it. The story of Ronan and Scarlett reminds us that love can come from the most unexpected places, from moments that seem meaningless at first, that none of us has to be alone forever, and sometimes all we need is the courage to open our hearts, to let someone step into our lives. No matter who you are, no matter how dark your past may be, love can heal every wound if you give it a chance. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit like and share this video with the people you know who still believe in love and second chances. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss moving stories every day. We'd truly love to know how you feel about this story. Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? Do you believe love can change a person? Leave a comment below and share what's in your heart. We're always listening, and we value every single comment you leave. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.